Monica Morris is a safety professional with more than 15 years of experience. She graduated from the University of Central Missouri with a bachelor's degree in industrial safety management. Before working with the CSU Health and Safety Consultation program, Monica worked in the renewable and bioenergy industry, where she provided comprehensive environmental health and safety compliance management. Outside of work, Monica enjoys an active life with her husband and two children exploring Colorado, snowboarding, biking, gardening, camping, and live music. Thanks for joining us today, Monica. I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here and let me know, is everything visible? It says permit required confined spaces.
Looks good.
All right, perfect. Thank you. Well, thanks again for having me. I am going to pretty much jump right into the presentation. Permit required confined space per OSHA regulations is not a new standard. And I'm sure most folks on this call or training have heard of this standard before. So just to go ahead and get right into it. Let me see if I can get this to go. Oh, no. Sorry. All right, some objectives I have here is to differentiate between the permit required confined space and a confined space. Describe what maybe workers might incur in a permit required confined space and how that you can control those hazards. And also, I have a basic permit, and we're going to talk about that and how that relates to the permit required confined space. So, just a basic definition. What is a confined space? Well, a confined space must meet all of the following. It's large enough to bodily enter and perform work. It is not designed for continuous human occupancy, and it does have limited entry and egress. So there's a lot of really small places that bodies can fit into. While OSHA definitely is concerned that spaces that small spaces that bodies can fit into could cause hazards to employees. The agency really isn't intended to cover such little bitty spaces like this, like going into a box or anything like that. That type of stuff isn't covered under the confined space standard with limited restricted access. So you can see from these photos that there is a lot of manways, hatchways going down. You have to open like different manways, unbolt them, and it's definitely you have to put your body into a different. You have to bend over. You have to crouch down. You have to use two hands to get into the spaces. So that is limited, restricted access. And these are some great photos to really show, especially with the white tanks here at the very top and here at the bottom left corner. Questions that help you determine a limited egress. And this is all, questions that you can think to yourself as you're evaluating your confined spaces at your business or at your site locations. So when you do look at your different confined spaces and configurations, these questions definitely will assist you in determining if it does have limited egress. Do you have to use both of your hands to get in? Do you have to use a ladder to access the manway? Do you have to use a ladder to go down into the space, such as a well? Do you have to stoop or bend your body to enter into the space? And a lot of those the manways are, 12-inch manways, 18-inch manways. So you have to, definitely contort your body to get into those tanks and configurations like that. With the configuration slow or impair rescue. And that's something really important to ask yourself as you are investigating your spaces and doing this an evaluation on them. Because does that lifeline, will it tear or will it, snag or will it cause an impedance? So you need to really look at the configuration and how that would affect that any sort of self-rescue. And can doors be opened from the inside of the space? Permit required confined spaces are confined spaces that have at least one of the following: the actual or potential atmospheric hazard, contain material that has the potential for engulfment. So it already has, liquid inside of it. An internal configuration that an entrant could be trapped or become asphyxiated, or it contains any other recognized serious hazard. Um, when I talk about the internal configuration, I have some good pictures here, but inwardly converging walls, such as like hopper tanks and stuff like that. That is definitely an internal configuration where an entrant could become trapped. Atmospheric hazards. So, does the space contain or have the potential to contain an atmospheric hazard? And this is really important aspect when you are doing your evaluation of your spaces about the atmospheric hazard. So you really need to have somebody that really knows the process of what that tank or that space is connected to, and what could maybe naturally occur, say if it's underground. But an hazardous atmosphere could cause death, incapacitation, or impair the ability to do a self rescue. And a self rescue is to be able to get yourself out of that space when you start to become aware of the signs and symptoms of any kind of overexposure. Some examples could be oxygen concentration, could be flammables, or toxic atmospheres, or that could become immediately dangerous to life and health. It could be a combustible dust. So those are all considered atmospheric hazards. When we look at oxygen concentration, this is very important, because oxygen concentration, definitely that's what we're breathing right now. I mean, we're probably breathing around 20.8% just right here in our offices or just in normal. So whenever you do evaluate oxygen, and it's very important to have that your gas meter, which I'll get into, so you can have a direct readout of what the oxygen concentration is in your confined spaces. But you can see here the health effects of low oxygen. So if you have your monitor and it's reading in between 19.5 and 23.5, things should be considered normal at that point. But if it starts to fall and it gets down to like between 12 and 16, you can start to see the effects of that. Deep breathing, faster heartbeat, poor thinking, poor coordination. And it's important for entrants, attendants, and anybody part of the entry team to understand the oxygen, the effects of low oxygen. And you can even see here at the very bottom, if it drops down to 4 to 6%, and you have that, you basically a human will go into a coma within 40 seconds. Some oxygen concentrations, causes of some oxygen deficiency. It could be absorption, like wet activated carbon, consumption, combustion, a chemical reaction, some, workers, displacement, like anaerobic process, a fermentation process, something that's giving off CO2. Obviously, if you have high CO2, you're going to have low oxygen, and different work practices could cause oxygen deficient atmospheres. Oxygen levels greater than 23.5 are considered an oxygen enriched atmosphere. So something that could possibly cause this would be, if you have a confined space entry going on and the workers inside of it are welding, oxygen could build up and that could cause an explosive atmosphere. Flammable gas, vapor, or mist. So here's just some limits of the flammability, but a flammable gas in excess of 10% of the lower flammable limit is considered a hazardous atmosphere. And when you have your gas monitor and that you are reading that as you are evaluating the confined spaces you're about to enter, or like during the actual entry. This is one of the parameters that you're going to be looking at, is the if there's any kind of flammable gas or vapors, and if it is in excess of 10% of the LFL, it is considered a hazardous atmosphere. And the the flammable limit is the lowest percent by volume of gas in air that will burn or explode if a flame or other ignition source is present. And I know that a lot of work that goes on in tanks are tank repairs. And to be able to properly do a tank repair, a lot of time that involves welding and testing the welds and doing that sort of thing. So that's something to very much take into consideration, is what work activity is really going on inside of that space, that has to do with the maintenance, maintaining it, or making a repair or something like that. So it's very important to understand what kind of flammable gas or vapor mist that could have you could have exposure to while during that entry. Combustible dust is another one. So airborne combustible dust at its lower flammable limit. So vision would be obscured to less than 5 feet, and that's pretty much if you open up like a grain bin or something that has considerable dust and you can't see in front of your face, more than 5 feet, then that is going to be considered a flammable or a flammable atmosphere, and that's due to with the combustible dust. Wood dust, there is a specific, you know, um, numerical value for that. So just keep that in mind with wood dust. Toxics, that could be anything that is specific to that space that is a potential toxic based on the process, based on the location. So acute effects could central nervous system depression, severe irritation, vomiting, immediately dangerous to life and health. An atmospheric concentration of any substance that is capable of causing death, incapacitation, impairment of ability to self-rescue or cause injury, or is oops, I is covered by this provision. So I'll update that. I apologize for this. But the health effects is covered by this provision. Engulfment. This is something that can definitely happen and does happen. It happens all the time. But this is an engulfment, and especially when you are doing a confined space entry, when it's associated with grains, and getting the grain to flow, or the other flowable solids or liquids to get out of a space. So that is something that definitely can happen. What you're seeing here is, this is obviously a very a not accepted practice of walking down grain to get it to flow. Obviously, the grain was had moisture in it, and I guess it like won't flow. It was basically attached, or very solid. So they put a person inside this bin and had them walk down the grain to get it to flow out the lower auger. And this is a very unaccepted practice. But it does happen. So I wanted to definitely show this. But there are other ways to get the grains or other flowable solids to move, other than putting a human inside of the bin to be able to do that. Internal configuration. This is kind of what a really good photo for internal configuration of inwardly converging walls. Inwardly converging walls definitely causes, a self-rescue issue, and is very limited egress and ingress on that. So the configuration would definitely trap or asphyxiate a worker if they're in there with especially if there's material in there, or there's any kind of sloping floors or taper to a smaller cross section, which you can definitely see in these type of tanks. And I could, this is very a common tank in the agriculture type industries. Serious hazards. Those could be exposed live electrical. It could be unguarded mechanical hazards. These things should be definitely taken into consideration with like mixers or agitators, blades, and stuff like that. So you can see there's other mechanical hazards. So there's a lot of other serious hazards that could be associated with a permit required confined space, not just atmospheric hazards and toxics. Okay. Recycled water tanks is another interesting configuration of a confined space. And this is a lot of tanks and they're connected, interconnected. And that is another thing that really needs to be taken into consideration whenever you're looking into controlling hazards associated with that confined space to make it safe for entrant. Um, Culverts is another confined space. Um, just another picture with that. Um, the entry team. So we have the duties of the entry team. We have the permit associated with that confined space entry. There's monitoring and potential ventilation. And then there's a rescue and emergency services that all go into a confined space entry. So what is the entry? Is when it is defined as when any part of the body breaks the plane of the opening of the permit required confined space. And that is directly from the OSHA standard. The entry team is comprised of an entry supervisor, the attendant, and the entrant. The entry supervisor, and this is a very important role, they all three are really, but the entry supervisor, they need to know and have the understanding of the hazards associated with a permit required confined space, the signs and symptoms of any kind of overexposure to what could potentially be the hazards in there, and the consequences of that, what could happen. They're going to verify that the written permit is acceptable, has acceptable entry conditions listed on there. And they're going to be the person that authorizes the entry. And they're going to oversee entry operations as a whole. This person could also terminate entry if any of the acceptable entry conditions deviate from the acceptable status. That could be, cause for termination of the entry. And that would be that entry supervisor communicates with that attendant and that entrant and says, you need to get out, you need to get out now. And then that's determined as a termination of that entry. The entry supervisor will also verify rescue services and to make sure that they are available and have the knowledge of the permit required confined space that has been entered, and that make sure that they have the equipment necessary and that they understand what that a rescue would look like in that specific space. And also, the entry supervisor is authorized to remove any sort of unauthorized individual. So you really have to have good security around that. You don't want random people, workers, contractors, visitors walking up during a confined space, distracting and being in the way while you're doing this very important job, and while that person's in there. So any unauthorized individuals could be removed by that entry supervisor as part of their responsibility. The attendant, that's going to be like the person standing outside the confined space while it's going on, or the standby. You might have heard that before. But the attendant standby is they're going to know what the hazards are associated with the confined space, the signs and symptoms of any kind of exposure, and what those consequences are. Especially with behavioral effects. And as you can see, with the loss of oxygen, that definitely has some spelled out behavioral effects that are associated with loss of oxygen. That attendant is going to monitor entrance and maintain continuous communication. So what that means is the attendant is going to be talking to that entrant while they're in the space. They're going to be making sure, asking questions if they're all right, how they're feeling, and they're going to have continuous communication. And that could be verbally, like talking to each other, or with a radio communication, but they need to maintain continuous communication with that entrant while the confined space entry is active. They're going to be monitoring, the attendant's also going to be monitoring hazards and activities in and outside of the permit space. So, what's going on? So, the attendant's going to be knowledgeable about what is going on, the scope of work, what is that attendant doing inside of there, about how long, that entrant's going to, be doing the work. And they're going to be monitoring the activities outside of the space as well, such as weather rolling in, people like coming in and out of the area that the work is being done. So they're going to be monitoring things inside and outside. So this person that is the standby attendant has a very, very active role with what is going on inside of that space as well as what's going on immediately outside that space. And the attendant is also going to remain outside that entry point for the duration of the entry. And that means that they're not going to take a break. When break time runs around, or if they have to use the restroom or whatever, they cannot leave that entry point while there is an active entry going on. That attendant is to remain outside that entry point at all times. If something happens and there is not another qualified attendant, then at that point the attendant needs to ask ask the entrant to come out and take care of whatever needs to take care of if they have to walk away to get tools, if they have or whatever. So that is very important. It's not just like, hey, I'll be right back, everything's okay. As long as the attendant as long as there's an entry going on, the attendant is to remain outside that entry point, and controls the entry point. They're not going to let people stick their heads in while the entrant is doing work. They're going to make sure that they are controlling that entry point at all times. And then they have the ability to summons rescuers, if needed, and that is through whatever means is described in the permit. You're going to call them on the cell phone, call 911. You're going to, if they're on site, ready to respond if something happens. And this also includes any kind of non-entry rescue if required. So that attendant would initiate and perform a non-entry rescue if that would be required. So the attendant has a very, very active and important job when it comes to the confined space entry. The entrant, the person that is going into the space, they need to know the hazards associated with the space. They need to know the symptoms, the signs and symptoms of any kind of overexposure. They also need to know the consequences of that overexposure, the use of equipment properly. And that is something that is very important and comes along with training. You need to understand, like in this picture that I have up here, how to use the tripod and winch system appropriately, as well as the harness and where to hook onto, and how that works, the whole system works. They need to understand that, and that it's not just like watching a video. You need to definitely practice, put on this equipment and utilize the equipment, understand it so you have confidence in that equipment. They need to also understand that they have a responsibility to communicate regularly with the attendant, to let them know their status, let them know how they're feeling and how things are going. If the unexpected occurs, they're going to have to alert the attendant. So that, again, that communication needs to be consistent and reliable. And that entrant is also going to exit immediately if a hazard develops that is inconsistent with the acceptable entry permit conditions. So if he is called to exit the space then he needs to exit. They need to exit immediately if something deviates. The permit requirements are pretty well spelled out in the standard. The permit needs to have the space to be entered, the purpose of the entry, the date and duration, who the entry team is, the signature of the entry supervisor, the hazards of the space, the isolation measures. And when we're talking about isolation measures, this could actually fall under another type of permit or other procedures such as lockout, tagout procedures. But you need to have your isolation measures of how that you made that space safe. Acceptable entry conditions, test results, and the test results are from the air monitoring equipment. So you will log the results of the air monitoring readings, and you'll put that down on that permit in writing. Rescue emergency services, what communication procedures are being used by the company, and any kind of necessary equipment that is being utilized for that space. And that's very important because not every space is obviously configured the same, and different spaces could need different equipment and any other information necessary. So with this is just an example of a permit, but it ensures that that all means and practices and procedures necessary for um, the safe permit entry have been conducted. Completed permits must be available to the entrants or their representatives at all times, and the permit should be issued only for the time it'll take to complete the task. A permit must be canceled when the task is finished or conditions of the space have changed. And something that could cause a change. I mean, if you have, say, a blank and you've rolled out a valve and you have a blank in there and the blank somehow shifted and now it is not isolating anymore, that would be a deviation from the safe entrant. So that would prompt a change, if you will. The permit should be retained for 1 year and used to review the the permit required space annually. So you should be reviewing these permits, and if there is a permit canceled for a deviation, that needs to stay on. You need to keep retain. You have to retain that for up to a year, and you do need to do annual reviews of your confined space program. Air monitoring. So air monitoring inside the permit required confined space should be done before and during the confined space entry. And you're going to check the oxygen, any kind of flammables, any kind of specific gases or vapors that are associated with the specific space. And these are just some examples of some personal air monitors right there. And testing the air. This is very important, and you need to get the right equipment to do this. But you're going to check at all levels of the permit required space, not just at the very top of it. And you need to check any areas that could create pockets of air, such as bins or anything like that, any sort of impedant areas, areas that could cause a airflow impedance. So it's very important, and our equipment to do that is available, such as extension wands. You could hook on the end of your air monitor to get down. You could use tubing, different things to get down to the depths of where, so you can do an accurate air monitor reading for where the person is going to be working throughout the entire confined space. So that's very important, is to test the air and to have the proper equipment to test the air throughout the entire confined space. Just some more air monitoring equipment examples here: Draeger tubes, the pumped air monitors, which are really good. The Ventus MX for this industrial scientific, that's a pumped air monitor. You can see it's pulling air through. It has a pump on it. The one off to the side, this MX, the Venti MX for the black one, that's going to be just see the sensors, the white sensor. So that's going to be a personal monitor in the immediate area. It does not have a pump pulling through. Ventilation. This is another important aspect and another consideration whenever you're looking at your equipment for, safe confined space entry. But, most common ventilation is going to be dilution. So you're going to open up the manway and it's going to dilute naturally. Also, you can have, forced air. You can have exhaust push through so you can ventilate the space quicker than just the dilution. But ventilation could potentially be necessary depending on the space that you are that you are entering. And it's important to have the proper ventilation. This is electric. So these are little Allegro elephant trunk type um, ventilation fans. Yeah, that's definitely, you can utilize that. And this guy looks like he's going down into a well with a tripod usage right there with the winching system. But keep in mind that these electric fans are good, especially if there is no risk of having any sort of flammable atmosphere. I don't have a picture of it, but if there is a flammable atmosphere, then you need to take that into consideration and definitely utilize something that can be bonded to ground, and like the pneumatic air horns. Those are good for that. Ventilation considerations, definitely bonding and grounding, and then having power sources, backup power if something happens, sources of supply of air supply. That's very important too. And exhaust air and placement of that ventilation equipment. You're definitely not going to place the ventilation equipment right next to the exhaust of the work truck. That's kind of defeating the purpose. So you need to really be aware of where you place that ventilation equipment in regard to supplying air into the spaces. With rescue options, so a company would need to arrange for rescue from an outside source, arrange for a company employees to perform or to perform rescue, provide for non-entry rescue. So those are all requirements whenever you're doing a permit required confined space. Outside rescue is response time appropriate? There's some things you need to ask yourself where you're located. Does your local fire department do they have an agreement with you? Have they worked specifically with you, and are they willing to come to your space, come out to your site if there is a confined space entry going on? Those are all questions to definitely talk about with your teams to make sure that you have appropriate rescue in regard to where you're located. And does that rescue team have the appropriate equipment? Are they informed of the hazards associated with the permit required confined space? And do they have planning? Have they planned for it? Have they done practices? Have they been out to your site and have you showed them your confined spaces? Non-entry rescue is a great option. But rescuers are, with a non-entry rescue, you have to have the correct equipment and the entrant needs to be connected. But rescuers are not allowed to enter the confined space. Retrieval system used in combination with a chest harness is a really good option for that, especially, with going underground in this situation, like you can see here. But a mechanical device must be used for retrievals more than 5 foot deep, and that's on vertical entry right there. With the use of contractors, so the host employer does have some responsibilities associated with utilizing contractors. They need to inform the contractor that the workplace contains permit required confined spaces, and especially with what they're going to be doing, you need to make it clear that the entry is only allowed through a compliant permit space program. Okay, so that host employer is also going to share all known information about the space, including hazards and any kind of past experience. So there has to be communication, and they need to communicate all precautions, the procedures, protective measures in place for employees working in or near the space, and coordinate entry operations when both host and contractor employees will be involved, and conduct a post-entry debriefing with the contractor to review the program used and any hazards encountered or created during the entry. And that is directly from the CFR 1910-146C8, and that's in general industry. Contractors have the responsibility to obtain all available information from the host employer regarding hazards and entry operations. So the contractor has responsibility to ask for that, and coordinate all entry activities with that host employer when both parties may be in or near the permit space or spaces. And they need to inform that host employer about the contractor's permit space program. So the contractor that is being hired or being utilized to do the confined space entry at the host employer's site does need to have a permit space program also. And report any hazards identified or created during the work, either during the job or during the post entry debrief. So it talks about the requirements. Basically, it's communication and with the contractor and the host employer to gather the information and discuss the hazards, entry procedures, and talk about each other's programs and the requirements for that. And that's what I have. So if you guys have any questions, I can take them now.
All right, thank you, Monica. Any questions can be dropped in the chat. I'm not seeing any right off.
All right, perfect.
All right, thank you, Monica, for joining us today. I saw a question after the last one just about whether or not these presentations will be available. We will be working to get them up on our YouTube and getting the links out to folks in our weekly newsletter. So please watch your inbox for that as we go forward. A poll likely just popped up on your screen, just helping us get a sense of what you all would like to see, what would be most helpful next year in these safety trainings, and so that we can be as attentive to the things you're seeing on your operation, the challenges that you're seeing, and the needs that you guys have as we do those. So if y'all could fill that out for us, that would be extremely helpful. And then just the last thing I have before I let everybody go is this piece, specifically the second piece with the confined spaces, is going to be it's going to have a follow-up component, an in-person field days type component in the spring. So we're working on that. We'll put out more information through our usual communication channels, mostly via our newsletter, as we get more details on that. But we're working to make that as productive as possible, potentially in English and in Spanish, to address confined spaces and make sure that everybody can work on their operations in those confined spaces with the knowledge of what is and what isn't, which Monica helped us out immensely today, and then also on best practices in a real live hands-on way. So with that, I'm going to close this out. I appreciate everybody joining us today. If you haven't already dropped your name, your business, and your policy number in the chat for Brittany, please do so before we close out so that you can get credit for being here today. Ultimately, if you have any questions about the safety group, Brittany is our staff in charge of that and can answer any of those questions. So please feel free to reach out to her or to anybody on the staff with any questions you might have about the work we're doing here every day. With that, thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Have a great rest of your day.